Traditionalism is the ideology that believes in the preservation of culture, that the lessons of the past help inform us about how to solve the problems of today and plan for the future. But culture is a vague term. Whose culture am I preserving? I, as an ethnic European, of course advocate for the preservation and propagation of my own culture. What is the European culture? Well, depending on how you view it, you could say that the European culture encompasses all cultures descended from the Proto-Indo-European people. However, while it is true that Europeans are descendants of that early society, so are the Kurds, Iranians, Armenians, Indians, as well as various other ethnic minorities located in the northeastern Middle East region. So how do we define European culture then? We can simply move a step down the family tree and recognize the following cultural tribes as Europeans: the Germans, the Celto-Italic people, the Illyrians, and the Slavs. That's all well and good, but what do all these tribes share in common? The simple answer is values. Every European group shares the same concepts of how things ought to be, a code of morals and ideals which we strive towards. But how do these morals and ideals come about? A long time ago on the Central Asian steppe, our ancestors, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, were a semi-nomadic people, with herdsmen traveling with their herds ranging over large territories, and small to medium-sized settlements existing to have a place to protect and feed livestock during the winter. Eventually men would rise to power by taking tribute from farmers in exchange for protection against invaders and bandits. These men would become the first nobles, named after their virtues of heroism, and are incidentally the foundation for many of the heroic stories we find from ancient Europe, particularly relating to cattle raids. But being a leader is not just about protecting your land and your people. It is also about ensuring their prosperity. Due to the nomadic nature of herding life, it was necessary for agreements to be struck about where herds could graze, and so a concept of honor was created. If you could not be trusted to show mutual respect and uphold the values of society, you were ostracized as someone who was detrimental to the community. We observe that in this line of logic lies the basis for the first form of legal system, based around an individual's honor, where a person's reputation revolved around their dependability to do the right thing. Finally, we have the concept of freedom. Due to the mobile nature of the European people of these times, it was important to respect the freedom of people, as they had the ability to move on to the next kingdom if they didn't agree with the king's actions. And so the kings of old recognized the necessity for allowing people to have autonomy. If a king tried to wrongfully impose upon an individual, his other subjects may come to understand that the king may try to wrong them in a similar manner, so then they would move on to a better kingdom, and the tyrant king would find himself without subjects. But what does this all mean for traditionalism in the context of today? How would a traditionalist view society as it should be in a modern context? The main problems of society today is firstly a spiritual one, where people no longer believe in a higher calling, but instead choose to believe in the materialistic outcome that the best thing a person could be is rich, and that humanity's great destiny existed in the far-off future, when humanity no longer even resembles us, as we are now. This is the altar of science, and of the march of quote-unquote progress. The problem with this outlook is that it ignores the good parts of humanity, and instead posits that humanity is debased, and it can only be salvaged through a blind march through time. However, this progression of time does not mean anything good for humanity, if we do not know where we are going, or for what purpose. We are simply told to get on with it, to drag society behind us like slaves. Traditionalism rejects this view of the world and instead seeks to establish the idea that it is humanity that makes us great, that humanity is what connects us to the higher principles and higher powers of the universe. For example, the concept of freedom is a completely alien concept to the world of animals. No animal understands freedom or advocates for it. No animal is brave, but instead relies on their instincts to act. Traditionalism asks for men and women not to focus on making money or progressing society, but finding what makes them happy and healthy. It is key for people to not only explore who they are, but to grow themselves to a point where they are content in life and free of unnecessary troubles. This ascendancy is why traditionalists seek out heroic leaders to establish communities and even nations, so that we may be free to live life as we see fit, and to pursue our own goals of spiritual fulfillment. To be a traditionalist is to reject the debasing power of the herd, to make yourself stand out, and to develop your personality to what you think is an ideal. Traditionalism does not assign classes in society based on wealth, but instead assign classes based on personality. To the great men among us they would form the noble class of selfless leaders, dedicated to the protection and prosperity of the realm. To the mystic spiritualists they would be assigned as priests, druids and sages, dedicated to the exploration of the higher realms, as well as guides for other people. To the steadfast and brave, who would not shrink at the sight of conflict, we would assign the class of warrior, dedicated to the defense of people and way of life. The common man who wishes no greatness but pursues happiness through his labor, we assign the class of worker. This class ironically would encapsulate the majority of people in society today, due to their obsession with material wealth. Finally, we have the outsider, those who do not wish to partake in our culture or society, but instead stick to their own. These people aren't inherently good or bad. It is merely remarked that they seek to undermine our way of life through undue influence, demanding equal recognition when they have contributed little or indeed seek to disturb the peace and stability of our society. This is how traditionalism structures a society, not based on wealth, but based upon the inherent nobility of a person and their personal desires. It is generally held that great people would be selfless and not driven by material desire. Instead, they would seek to promote peace and prosperity. This leads to why you would desire a traditionalist government rather than a quote-unquote progressive government. Simply put, a traditionalist government demands that those with power be better and adhere to cultural values in their decision-making, where a progressive democratic government makes no such demand. Modern democratic governments instead favor manipulation and backdoor deals, with an emphasis on obtaining as much money as possible in as short a time as possible. Why is this? Well, democracy relies on getting large groups of people to vote, and you can't represent every voter faithfully. So instead, politicians are forced to make general statements and fabrications in order to garner as much support as possible. Then, at the end of the election, you have to make deals within your party or with other parties in order to claim the highest office, which undoes the point of an election, which is to represent your constituents. After that, politicians have all the deals they made with corporations to fund their campaigns, which again invalidates the election. Not to mention, after all those backdoor deals and lies, you then only have 4 years in office before you're threatened with being replaced. So what's the most common move? The most common course of action is to spend as much money as possible and to launder as much money as possible, because a politician cannot guarantee that they will be elected again, especially when it does not necessarily depend on the voters, but also internal party politics. This entire system favors those who are manipulative and dishonest, deceiving the voters into voting for you by pretending you represent them in any capacity. Democracy and progressivism have no principles and no values. All they value is getting into power to make as much money as possible before being forced to leave. As a result, this means the leadership of a democracy cannot recognize non-material based motivations or make any long-term future plans, and as such leads them down the path of degeneration, as they seek to sell out as fast as possible before being held accountable for their treacherous actions. To end this video, I will simply state that traditionalism believes in the good of humanity, and that the traditions passed down from our forefathers were intended to bring us prosperity, and it is my intention to spread those traditions as far and wide as possible.